If you're about to buy a house, this video is for you because we're going to talk about something that could be more important than the actual purchase price when buying a house. And what is that? Well, I have three diagrams here and they all go together. So it's just as important to watch the video all the way through in detail. And that item is getting your closing costs paid for by the seller. And we're going to compare, purchase price, closing costs paid for in the middle one here. But first, before we get there, what are closing costs? Well, in this diagram here, I have a circle because there's a bunch of many different items in there. And you might see the appraisal fee in there, loan origination fees, title work, you get the closing title work fees. So there's a whole bunch of different things in there. And we may be asking, when do you have to pay them? Well, a lot of the time is that they're due at closing, so you can close in the house. And next question, how expensive are these? Well, they're very expensive. You can see around 2% to 5% of the loan amount for closing costs. So you can start doing the math if you're going to buy a house. And we have an example here that we'll talk about in a little bit, but you can start doing the math of, holy moly, I didn't think that they would be that much. And, the last bullet point I have here is that the seller can actually pay for them, which leads me to my next diagram here is, closing costs paid for versus the purchase price. Because a lot of times people say, you know what, this purchase price is gonna be 300,000, but I don't even want to go 290. Well, let's rewind this a little bit. So you do really want the house, but you don't want to pay 290 for it, which I understand. But what about closing costs? That's a very important discussion to be had because we just talked about those closing costs. More than likely, they're due at closing. So let's go through a scenario right here. And this is just an example, but let's just say $300,000 is the purchase price of the house. And maybe you want to do 290,000, no closing costs paid for, versus maybe you stick around that same price, but you have 8,000, maybe your closing costs are going to be 8,000. So maybe you have $8,000 of the closing costs paid for by the seller. And let's talk about the 290. Well, to go from 300 to 290, your monthly payment is probably, it's not going to be that noticeable, okay? Versus paying 8,000 up front, that's a lot of money to, at one time. So there's that scenario. Now let's talk about 8 years. Why did I draw 8 years next? That's the average home ownership in the United States. So you might be thinking, well, the interest on the loan, over time it's going to add up and I'm going to be paying so much more if I stick with the 300,000 versus the 290. Well, the statistics say that you're probably only going to live in the house for about 8 years. So you may be thinking, yeah, over the span of 30 years, interest, but the statistics say in 8 years, you might be having the conversation of moving again. So you're not maybe even going to notice that because you actually might be selling your house and buying the next one. So that's something to think about there. And let's talk about this next. So we're going through back to that scenario with 290 versus getting 8,000 in closing costs if you stick around that same $300,000 price. Now, if you get those closing costs paid for by the seller, so instead of spending $8,000 at closing costs, now maybe you're already going to spend that money. Now you could pocket that money and put in some renovations. So maybe you want to get new countertops, maybe you want to get some new flooring, paint, all that stuff. Now you actually have the money to do that and put that in your house versus spending that closing costs and have the seller pay for that. So that's something maybe you'd want to consider too, is having some renovations, okay? Negotiations, okay? So now let's just run through a scenario. Maybe you're going to buy the house and you have a home inspection, okay? And something comes up in that home inspection. Now, and both parties agree, okay, we're gonna do something here. Now, instead of dropping the purchase price, yeah, I'll drop $5,000 off the purchase price of my house. Or you could ask for credit for closing costs. So then you have to pay that money, that $8,000. Maybe you get a $5,000 credit from the seller. Now you don't have to pay that upfront, that $5,000. The seller is gonna contribute to your closing costs. So that's something to consider too, and how important it also is to know a little bit about negotiations. But now you may be thinking, but Tanner, what if the house isn't worth 300,000? What if we're overpaying? Well, this next point is it going to talk about something that could prevent that? And what is that? That's called the appraisal contingency. Now this can protect the buyer from, in essence, overpaying for a house. So how does this work? So let's just say you're getting a loan and you get the appraisal to come out there, and the appraisal, they do comparative analysis as well to see how much they actually want to give a loan out for banks, so you know, people aren't overpaying. Okay, so whatever number they put up, say $300,000 is the purchase price that we come and agree to. Now the appraisal comes in at 280. Well, now you can go back in negotiations because the bank is only lending 280,000 and there's 20,000 to go to reach 300,000. How are you going to close that gap? Is the buyer going to come out of pocket and pay that difference? Is the seller going to come down in price? Are the sellers and the buyers going to meet in the middle? All right, that's all to be had in negotiations, but it's also just as important to get that contingency in place because it's, you know, kind of a leverage play. Because you could say, you know, as a buyer, you know, Mr. Seller, if you don't come down in price, we'll just go on to the next place. So that you might have some leverage on there. And if you don't drop the price down to us, well, you're probably going to have to do it to the next person if we back up, because that's kind of what the banks appraise, what they're all thinking the house is valued at. So that's a leverage play for the buyer. Okay. And also there's so many checks and balances because they don't want to overvalue house and loans and then maybe get foreclosed, they got to sell the house again. There's so many different scenarios why there's lots of checks and balances when getting appraisals through the whole loan process to prevent any problems like that. And lastly, buyer assurance. So now you get the appraisal contingencies, and let's rewind a little bit. Maybe you also got a home inspection contingency. Maybe you also got a sewer line inspection contingency, and then the appraisal contingency. So you have the actual structure. You feel pretty confident about that. It gives you assurance there that, okay, the house looks pretty solid. Maybe there's a couple of minor things. Next, sewer line. We can't actually, the second time we walk through a house, we can't see the sewer line pipes. We don't know what it looks like, but now we got the inspection. Now we're feeling pretty, you know, confident there and sure that, you know, it looks pretty good. And lastly, on the financial money side with the appraisal contingency, okay, it appraised that value, so now we don't got to come out of pocket and we know the true value of the house and we're not, in essence, overpaying for something. So we feel pretty confident there. Okay, so that appraisal contingency ties into, well, what if we're overpaying for the house by staying at the purchase price? But that's what the appraisal contingency is for, to prevent that problem. So I think it's just very important to get your closing costs paid for because they're due more than likely up front to close on a house. And that's why people always, we're running back from the beginning again. Yeah, you know, I just 295, 290, 300 is, it's overpriced, but then you don't think about the closing costs what could come along with it and the closing costs that are due up front. So hopefully you learned something in this video. If you want to learn more about maybe a contingency, a closing cost, purchase, anything that you saw in this video, drop a comment below. I'll definitely do it. Thank you for watching. Have a good one. Bye.